Hello and welcome to Pit Talk, a Fox Sports and Speed Cafe Formula One podcast. On today's episode, we look ahead to this weekend's Dutch Grand Prix and the final 10 rounds of the Formula One season. My name's Michael Laminato, motorsport writer for Fox Sports Australia. It's great to have your company and the company of my co-host from Speed Cafe, having sunned himself in the northern summer, though not in Spain, before finally coming home. It's Ian Parks. Ian, how you going?
Really good, Michael. How's yourself?
I'm well. I'm looking forward to Formula One coming back this weekend. The mid-season break has been pleasant, but it's gone on long enough now, I think. It's ready to get into the second half of this Formula One season. And, I mean, we've talked about it many times on this podcast. Championships going in one direction, or has gone in one direction, depending on exactly how pessimistic you want to be about it, or optimistic if you're Dutch, I suppose. There is still a lot to look forward to in the second half of the year. We've got some really great storylines. Pretty lucky with this season in that respect. They've arrived at exactly the right time in terms of the competitiveness right out the front of the field. So I figured, Ian, we could talk a little bit about what exactly we're looking forward to between now and when the season ends in Abu Dhabi in November. There is plenty to think about. But if you had to pick one in our six for today, what do you think is one of the big storylines we're going to be thinking about in this second half of the year?
Number one on my list is anything other than a Red Bull victory. It's like 12 in a row. Let's face it, 12 in a row. It can't be knocked what Red Bull has achieved so far. Across all of Formula One history, nothing like this has been done, as we well know. So you've got to chapeau, a bit of French there, tip your cap. To doff your cap to Red Bull, Max Verstappen, for what they have done so far. But I think any Formula One fan, if you're A, not a Red Bull fan, or B, not a Max Verstappen fan, any Formula One fan must surely be looking forward to seeing somebody else, anybody else, standing on top of that podium over the final 10 Grand Prix of this season. Will it happen though? That's the thing, because the bottom line here, Michael, is that car is just bulletproof. The only thing that you can see happening to prevent what would be an entire clean sweep of the season is an accident. We don't want that to happen. That's the worst case scenario, of course. Or some form of unreliability to hit Max Verstappen. It has happened. We saw it happen in qualifying in Saudi Arabia, if I remember right. And that bopped him down further down the grid, and he still managed to do a brilliant drive in that Grand Prix. So can anything stop them? On what we've seen so far, no. But as we all know, this is Formula One. We've just got to hope that something might stop them, whatever that might be. So for me, number one on my list is seeing anything other than a Red Bull or a Red Bull driver standing on top of that podium. Anywhere, I don't care. It could be the last race of the season. Just please, somebody give us a different victor, please.
You might have to compromise and just accept Sergio Perez as a different winner, considering how powerful the car is. But you're right, isn't it? Like, thinking back to Saudi Arabia, I remember thinking at the time, having seen up to that point, the first two rounds anyway, or 1.5 rounds, that the car was so dominant, thinking, well, maybe this is a fast but unreliable car, or a fast but delicate car. I mean, the second round, unusual drive shaft failure as it was the time, I think, kind of random problem to have in a Formula One car these days. Maybe that's going to be one of the stories of the season, and I can't actually think of any real meaningful problem they've had since then. So they figured it out. But it's a beautifully timed choice for something you're looking forward to, Ian, because top of my list was actually exactly the opposite. I want to see Red Bull win all of them now, because there's nothing left. Let's be honest, you and me, Ian, we can be honest here.
Yeah.
The championship's done. Like, Max Verstappen, he's walking this championship at this point. Red Bull Racing, I think, more than double the points tally of Mercedes in second, if I could get up my points scorecard a little bit later on. They're wrapped up. There's nothing left for them to fight for, really, just to cruise home. And at some future episode of this podcast, we can talk about when we think that'll be. I want to see them do the unthinkable. I mean, we've gotten only so close in the past. We've talked about 1988. Only one race missed that season. It was a pretty freak occurrence if we talk about what it'll take. But I'm here to see them do it. I'm very neutral, completely neutral as a journalist, but part of me wants to just see it happen, to be there when it happens, don't you think?
I get that point, and I can understand that to some degree. But I think it's got to the stage now where Red Bull have dominated so much, especially since the introduction of these aerodynamic regulations at the start of that season, where they were just so far ahead of the curve going into the season that everybody has since been playing catch up and falling over themselves. Certainly this season to try and play catch up and just not getting there. That I think on both respects, it would be great to see somebody, as I mentioned, stand on top of the podium. But B, I do get your point that the Invincibles, the Unbeatables tag, to go through an entire, what is now a 22 Grand Prix season for this year would be something, well, we know it would be unprecedented. It's never been achieved. I don't know whether you have a similar thing that you can think of in Australian sport, but in British sport, we had a football team, Arsenal, that went through an entire Premier League season unbeaten. They obviously drew the tag the Invincibles when Arsene Wenger was in charge at that particular point. Again, just the most remarkable sporting feat. So, I don't know, as I say, whether you've got something similar in Australian sport that you can think of that could be in comparison. But certainly in F1 terms, I get what you're saying. To see them go completely unbeaten would be something quite extraordinary. And it was asked of Christian Horner a couple of times during the first half of the season before the summer break, could you do an Arsenal? Because obviously he's British, he knows all about Arsenal, etc. And he kind of like pushed it to one side. Oh, well, this could happen, that could happen. I think now, going into this second half, these remaining 10 races, it's something now that we seriously have to consider, that Red Bull has to consider. I'm sure he's going to be asked again in Zandvoort coming up this weekend for the Dutch Grand Prix, no doubt about it. And I'm sure he's going to sweep it under the carpet because there's 10 Grand Prix, and I'm sure it's going to be only something that he will likely address going into maybe the last 3 or 4 races. Say, for argument's sake, they now go and win the next 5 or 6 on the back of this. So they've got a 17, 18 race unbeaten streak, and then he can probably think, well, yeah, we could actually start to do this. Everybody within Red Bull can think, can we do the unthinkable? Because, let's face it, it is unthinkable. You can go into any start of any Grand Prix season, surely, considering looking at winning every single Grand Prix is just something that nobody with any team would think, yeah, we can do this. No chance. But now we're at this point in the season. I get your point. I get what you're saying. It would be something quite extraordinary to see that there in Formula One.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? It's one of the records. We have almost 2 categories of records. One that seem easier to beat now that the season is longer. Talk about things like successive victories in a season or total victories in a season, which Max Verstappen already has. And then ones that should be much harder, like undefeated seasons or things like that. Yeah. And yet somehow here we are, 12 into 22, so past the halfway mark of what, like you were saying, all of us at the start of the year were going, well, it's just too hard, too many races. I'll be very interested to know as well, because Red Bull plays it so cool in that regard. They really blasted past that previous record of consecutive race wins without even really looking like they were thinking about it too much, but did celebrate really hard afterwards, which I thought was kind of interesting, that clearly it was something they were thinking about. How much of a motivator, particularly when we get to those last 4 or 5 races, as you mentioned, when everyone's feeling the length of the season, people are getting tired, little mistakes might creep in. How much of a motivator having that, and acknowledging as well by then the championship will probably have been won, this will be, because it is unique. It's rare that some teams, when they've sort of got to the logical conclusion of their championship battles, have that little extra carrot. That could be very interesting. So I'm hopeful that at least we get to the last 4 or 5, and then we can talk about, well, who's going to beat them, and maybe someone could do it. If they don't win in Zandvoort, not only will all the Dutch fans be unhappy, but I'll also be a bit unhappy. But that's something we could talk about in future podcasts, I think.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at some other championship positions that are still live, because for me, naturally enough, one of the very interesting storylines is one that cropped up in only the last couple of rounds before the mid-season break, and is how good is McLaren really this part of the season? We know they've brought a couple of rounds of really major upgrades just before the break. They've got a little bit more to come after the break before, logically, as everyone else will, start looking towards next season. But we were teased some really big performances, weren't we? I mean, Silverstone was a genuinely second best, no doubters performance. And Lando Norris in particular, and also Oscar Piastri really stood up there. Then I don't want to say anything's been muddied since then, but while there have been strong performances, very strong performances, including backup podiums in Hungary, they have been somewhat less emphatic. I know Toto Wolff was saying in Hungary, well, actually, Mercedes was the second fastest car, even though that's not where they finished. And then, of course, in Belgium, Oscar had a great weekend, taken out of the race. Lando had a much more difficult weekend. I'm really interested to see, A, how good they can be, and B, more interesting, I suppose, Ian, is whether they can usurp any of the teams that seem very established in the top four.
It's almost going back to that point that I mentioned in my first, what are we looking forward to? And where teams are effectively falling over themselves to be that best of the rest behind Red Bull. We saw it on so many occasions over that first part of the season where a team would bring an upgrade and all of a sudden they were the second best team, second quickest car. Next Grand Prix, somebody else would bring the upgrade, then they were the one that propelled ahead. So McLaren had its moment, most certainly, well, not a moment, but certainly a couple of great Grand Prix where they added these upgrades. Lando was magnificent in Austria. McLaren then, with both drivers, were fantastic, as you mentioned, at the British Grand Prix. And then Hungary, Belgium, again, they looked relatively strong. Oscar had his moment in the sun with that great second place in the sprint. And it was like, yeah, this looks like it now. McLaren has really pushed forward. They are going to be that second best team. And if they can add just little bits more, then this is them back. And then, as you say, they just kind of subsided a little bit in the Grand Prix, in particular in Belgium. That wasn't as strong as we'd seen previously, and you wonder, so what's coming now? What's the team going to do now to cement the platform that it has built for itself over the back end of that first half of the season? Because as we all know, they had major problems throughout the winter break, going into the first half of the first half. Let's look at it like that, shall we say? Because they hadn't developed the car. They were slow in developing the car. Then they brought the upgrades. Then they looked good. So what now can they do to hope, from McLaren perspective, from the McLaren fans' perspective, to hopefully, as you say, really push on and continue that fight, to take that fight to Mercedes and Ferrari and to Aston Martin in a certain respect? It's like, what's happened to them? That's part of this equation now as well that we're looking for in the second half of the season. What has it gone wrong for Aston Martin all of a sudden that they were the second best team, and now all of a sudden, as they came out of Belgium, the fifth quickest. That was their honest assessment after the Belgian Grand Prix. They dropped from second to fifth over the course of that first half of the season. But just to get back to your original point, and McLaren, as I say, it's all about what are they going to do now to really cement and build on this platform that they established for themselves at the back end of that first half of the season.
There is a little bit of an irony, maybe we'll talk about Aston Martin a little bit later though, that Aston was the first team to show you can make really big gains in a small amount of time, and then McLaren potentially has actually just done that job a little bit faster and a little bit better by bringing the upgrades in the middle of the season and maybe potentially ending the season as a faster car. We don't know that yet, of course. We need more sample sizes, and we've got some, on paper, particularly difficult tracks for the McLaren as we understand it at this point in time coming up. I'm thinking about Singapore in particular, slow speed, kind of not the kind of track that the MCL 60 would like, but upgrades do change things, so that will be interesting. I'm interested as well, Ian, though, McLaren, those big gains that we're talking about, and that's ultimately what's muddied the waters here, is that we don't know how good the team is because it's made such a big step in such a small time. How much that's knocked on to teams like Alpine. Now, they've had, as we talked about shortly before we adjourned for the mid-season, if you like, massive ructions in a managerial sense. People left the team. It seems like there's a bit of a shake-up. We still don't know who the permanent team principal will be there. It seems like the brand, as they continue to say, the brand for the project, as is the sentence Alpine quite likes, is having a really massive influence on how the Formula One team runs, and that's not historically been the best way. But how much McLaren making big jumps, and Aston Martin before them, are influencing teams like Alpine, which thought they could finish fourth or even third this year in the championship, are way back now, to create changes. You know, this interesting pressure between teams is a kind that we haven't seen in really quite a few years because of the rate of progress.
We're, again, just drawing back on a bit of a football analogy, we're kind of seeing teams making these changes because, as you say, of the pressure that's being applied, because the finance is now so massive in Formula One. What the teams bring in terms of the revenue from F1, from TV, advertising, all the sponsors that they have to bring on board as well now, and that's why they're all coming into Formula One. They're trying to take advantage of this real remarkable period for the sport, assisted by Liberty Media's takeover from Bernie Ecclestone 6.5 years ago now, as we know, and that's really changed the whole dynamic of the sport, I think. And what that has now done is it has brought in this pressure to succeed, which is so often the case within football. It doesn't matter whether it's British football, across many other countries. A manager of that team has to bring success. He has to make the right signings. He has to spend the right amount of money to bring in those signings. And in many respects, I think it's spilling up, that kind of mentality at the top of these teams is spilling over into that pressure that's being applied. They have to bring in success now because of the rewards that come on the back of it. And Red Bull, we saw Mercedes do it for a while, and now Red Bull have taken over as the number one team. They've got their own pressures in many respects. They're trying to stay ahead of everybody. But as we've discussed, it's all about trying to stay ahead, trying to stay competitive with your rivals. And that's why there's this tripping over themselves, as I've mentioned, to try and claw their way to the top, to be a challenger to Red Bull. And it's just creating this pressure that's leading to these changes elsewhere. It's just fascinating, I think, what's going on within other teams at the minute.
And it's funny though, isn't it? I mean, Alpine maybe is a really great example of this, not only for the changes they've recently made, but the way that the broader corporate structure is weighing on the team, and also because of the fact that it sold part of its team only a couple of months ago, only a minority stake, but nonetheless, they're now shareholders. And I thought it was really pertinent in that context, some of the comments Otmar made during the break or after the last race, after his last race, as it was at the helm of Alpine, saying that that's just not how Formula One works. That you can't get, despite what we've seen, I guess, with McLaren, where they've made big jumps, but you can't become ultimately successful in the way teams want to be, which is winning races regularly and contending for championships in the space of a year or even a couple of months. You know, for the big jump Aston Martin made, which really kicked off this trend, they're not title contenders. McLaren's made a big step forward, still not title contenders. No one's close to Red Bull Racing. It's interesting having these new people involved in Formula One, people who are, you know, not Formula One lifelong sorts of people, in the way that they were the only people we often really had involved in the sport because it was relatively niche compared to how it is now, are exerting these influences that aren't necessarily, at least as we understand it, maybe they'll end up being right, who knows, aren't necessarily the way Formula One works, right? Like, it's just not the way a team works. And for me, Alpine's going to be a really interesting test case in the next couple of years. This is beyond the second half of the season. We'll move on to another talking point in a moment. But how that team goes, I mean, I don't think I'm the only one who's saying I'm a little bit concerned about how that team's going to go, but it will be a very interesting test case.
I think it's a case that Formula One has evolved so fast over these past few years that the whole dynamic of the sport and the knock-on effect with each of the teams has changed. And we are now seeing a very, very different era for the sport in terms of how social media has evolved, for argument's sake, how teams are now building their business case compared to what they used to be. They're no longer just a racing team. They are now fully fledged businesses that go racing in many respects. they're not, as I say, it's not just a racing team that, oh yeah, we'll bring some sponsors on board. Now it's all about the business, and the racing. It's not quite secondary. We know it's not the case, but it's almost the case that racing and the business now has to go very much hand in glove with one another to ensure that the whole entity of a racing team is successful both on and off the track. I think that's what we're seeing now, and that's been this major game changer over these past few years since Liberty came in and took over from Bernie, which, as we know, was a very different era under Bernie.
Dramatically different sport now. All right, let's. What's next on your list then of things to look forward to? We've got a positive with McLaren, I guess, and maybe a negative with Alpine. What are you thinking?
It's got to be the Las Vegas Grand Prix, hasn't it? You know, I mean, come on. I mean, we know Max is going to win the title. That's a given. We can kind of work out roughly where that's going to be. Japan is probably going to be the first major opportunity, which, as we know, is where he won it last year. Qatar, that could be the one. If you're going to look at how the results could pan out, how the points are going to play out, Japan, as I say, first hit. Qatar, more than likely, not a great place to win it, really, in Qatar. You've got to think as well, just to add, just before I get on to Las Vegas, that's a sprint weekend. Max could effectively win the title on a Saturday. Could you imagine that?
That would be very interesting, wouldn't it? I don't know how I'd feel. I don't know if I'd feel comfortable about that.
Well, this is one of the things. Could he win a title on a non-Grand Prix day for the first time ever in Formula One history? That would just be. I'm not. I just say I'm a purist in many respects. I've followed the sport now for a long time, and I don't think I'd be too enamoured with that, to be honest. You know, a driver should win a race out of a Grand Prix Sunday, not a sprint event on the Saturday. But this again is part of the evolution that we've just discussed of Formula One and how much it has changed within just a very short period of time these past few years. So that could be that. We just added that now as part of this discussion.
That's something not to look forward to.
Not
Put that
to
on
look
the
forward
not to look forward to list.
But Las Vegas, surely Las Vegas, for most people, just seeing those cars, nighttime race, 10 o'clock. It's going to be very cool, by the way. Very, very cool conditions.
Yeah.
10 o'clock at night, mid-November in Las Vegas, we're probably looking at about 12 or 13 degrees. That's extremely unusual track temperatures for any Formula One car to operate in. We're not going to have 20, 30 degrees like we have at the Grand Prix around it and throughout most of the season. So, but again, just seeing those cars going down the strip, and the thing for Formula One is it has hyped this race to such a level now. It has to deliver. Ticket prices sky high for this event. Hotel prices sky high for this event. You can't get a ticket for it anymore. They're sold out, and people are paying the going rate, which is great for the sport, great for the city of Las Vegas, but now it has to deliver. And you've got to hope that the title will, as we know, because it's the penultimate race, the title will be done and dusted. You've got to hope that there is at least something out of that event, and we can say, wow, wasn't that great? Didn't that live up to the hype and the billing? Because otherwise it's going to be like, oh, you've spent all that money, we've had all this promotion, and it was like, oh great, really? That was it? Is that the best you can offer? Is that what we got to look forward to for the remainder of its contract? Because it only has a 3-year contract, but already there are discussions to go way beyond that. I'm pretty convinced that if they come out of this one in a good place, then we're going to be looking at another 10-year deal, as we've seen many of these contracts, many of these circuits now sign these long extended contracts. So Vegas for me, as long as it lives up to the hype, and I'm grateful that I'm going to be there. I hope for the viewing spectators, someone like yourself. Are you going to be there, Michael? You doing that one? out of
Oh,
interest?
I think it might be a little bit beyond the budget, to be honest, to be in Las Vegas, but also with the championship done. But I am very pleased
Yeah.
to say for Australians listening, it's on at the extraordinarily convenient time of 5 p.m. on a Sunday here. That is almost
Way.
too early to be prime time, but it is as good as prime time as races get, which is its own
Yeah.
interesting element. Like you say, it's going to make it very cold. I feel a little bit bad, I guess, for people on the east coast of the US who won't get to watch one of their 3 races because it'll be 3 in the morning or something in New York, to make sure people in Europe can watch it and to make sure the spectacle looks right on the TV. But you've mentioned it. It's been hyped a lot. It would be an incredible spectacle if it lives up to the hype. Now, I'm not going to hold it to the bar of the hype because I think that bar is just set way too high. A good Grand Prix, even a very good Grand Prix, probably wouldn't meet it. But I think in a weird way, they might be lucky that this first race has arrived in a season that, like you say, by the time we get there, championship's going to be done. There won't be a lot to race for. Hopefully, the racing will be good anyway. But I think the visual spectacle of the weekend is just going to be significant this year, right? Like, people are going to be wowed by seeing cars down the strip, all that kind of stuff. It's going to be a really big party, all that kind of thing. I think that's going to come across on the TV. Formula One's not going to let that not happen. But if the race is a dud, they've got a year where people aren't going to care that it was a bit of a dud because, wow, it's the first Las Vegas Grand Prix, and they can hopefully sort that out by next year. So that by the time we get to next year and a little bit of the novelty's worn off, and if we don't have a championship fight, hopefully we do and that sorts it out, then maybe we can make a couple of track changes, some tweaks here and there, whatever needs to be done to make sure that this race does end up being good. But also, the first race at a new venue is also always kind of interesting anyway, and I think that's also to its favour. It's always exciting to have a new track on the calendar, a track people won't have ever raced on before, obviously, because it's a street circuit. I think that's its own kind of excitement too. So I think they might just get away with it this year, but that shouldn't preclude them from thinking about how it can be improved, because on paper the track doesn't look incredible, but sometimes tracks that don't look great provide good racing anyway. But I don't know, I think that spectacle alone is going to be it's almost not going to look like Formula One, don't you think? Racing down the strip, I mean, that's video game stuff.
I get that point. You could almost argue that, we're going to be something that is futuristic in some respects, that we're going to see something so very different, even compared to Singapore. Singapore, for me, is one of my favourite Grand Prix on the calendar, not just as a race, but visually as well. I just think it looks fantastic. So, as you say, I think we're going to be wowed by the visual spectacle at Las Vegas, and it is going to offer us something very unique in many respects, because even Singapore compared to Las Vegas are two completely different venues. You've got, the neon of the strip, the Bellagio fountains, all these hotels, Paris, etc., that have this fantastic visual neon effect that, as you say, we're probably going to be certainly bowled over by for a short period of time. And then it always comes down then, doesn't it? If you think, right, what about the racing? That's the key aspect. And if you remember, I don't know if you recall, Michael, but Azerbaijan year one, which still really hasn't captured the imagination of the fans, which is a great shame in many respects. But year one, that race was awful. And it was like, oh my God, what are we doing here? And then the ones that followed were absolutely superb. And then we get this year, which wasn't a great one. But that period of time, for a good few years, Azerbaijan has generally provided us with fantastic Grand Prix, apart from year one. Is it going to be something similar this time around with Las Vegas? And is it going to look like a video game? There's going to be a little element of that, of course, because of the way Las Vegas looks. But, as I say, we're going to be wowed by the spectacle initially. We're going to be wowed by the visual impact. But as always with Formula One, it always boils down to, what about the racing? Fingers crossed. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, the track itself, we've got to wait and see. Hopefully, we're going to be wrong on that, and hopefully we do get something that at the end of the day looks more than a video game. Let's face it. I'm sure it will. I've still got good feelings about it. I'm sure it's going to give us something totally unique, totally different. And even though the title will be done and dusted by then, I'm pretty confident that we are going to see something that we're going to say, wow, can't wait for year two. Fingers crossed anyway.
Yeah. Azerbaijan's a good analogy, although if memory serves, the Formula 2 race that year, the first year, was I think what spooked the F1 drivers into behaving themselves, because there was some really questionable racing in that race, some action racing, and subsequently we got a little bit of a reduced spectacle for F1. But with no F2, I'm pretty sure, in Las Vegas, pretty sure they're not going. Maybe it'll be a little bit more straightforward. All right, let's bring this one home now and bring things back a little bit more to on-track action. We already mentioned them a little bit. Aston Martin is what I'm interested to see here, not just because of where they're going to finish, purely in the sporting element of it. Obviously, we all want to see Fernando Alonso get more podiums. Maybe he'll be the driver that breaks the Red Bull streak, if that's going to happen. Maybe it won't happen. But I want to know what the vibe for the team's going to be by the end of the year, because we all remember the first couple of races, Fernando on the podium in Bahrain. Great news story, right? This team that slept from 7 in the constructors' standings to what appeared to be second quickest car, fallen off the pace somewhere, and they've alluded to knowing where it is, but haven't explained it and haven't shown that they can recover from that. Of course, we've gone into the break, so they have a few more opportunities now to do that. But if they get to the end of the year and end up 5th fastest car, maybe 4th or 5th in the championship as well, considering if McLaren has a very good year, Ferrari can pull itself together. How's Aston Martin going to feel about that? Still a step forward, although only 2 places forward in the Constructors' Championship. In terms of pace, it is a pretty good step forward, obviously, if they're in that now potentially 5-car leading group. But I can't help but feel, if they end up 5th at the end of this first half of the season, having been so high at the start of it, that it's going to feel like maybe not just a wasted opportunity, because the opportunity was there to be taken, but that maybe actually the progress isn't as sustainable as we'd all hoped and thought it was.
They're a weird one, aren't they? They've amazed me this season for many different reasons, because they made, as you said earlier, they made this incredible step over the winter that no one expected. They caught everybody by surprise in Bahrain and the few races that followed, and you would have assumed, as is the natural course of evolution within an F1 team over the course of a season, that they would then build on that, and they would slowly but surely, hopefully, get closer to Red Bull, and it never happened. They've had the complete reverse of last season, whereby they started off badly, recognised their faults, corrected those faults, and had a relatively successful second half of the season for them, that allowed them to produce a number of reasonable results. But this season, as I say, complete reverse. Started off brilliantly, and then somewhere in development, and they've admitted it themselves, they've got it wrong. Mike Crack spoke about that at length, I remember, on the Thursday in Belgium. And he said that they just quite simply taken a wrong developmental turn, and for them the Hungarian Grand Prix, the race before, was the validation that they had made that wrong turn, that they now knew what to do to correct it. So hopefully we are now going to see a much stronger Aston Martin again over the second half of this season. Zandvoort, again, he did say that might not suit the car, and they were expecting that car to come strong again, or be strong again rather, from the Italian Grand Prix onwards. So hopefully from that point on, Aston Martin should be more firmly back in the mix, hopefully pushing Red Bull again. Somebody needs to push Red Bull. I know we've talked about this at the start of the top of the shop on this programme. Somebody needs to give Red Bull a run for their money. And wouldn't it be great if that guy that displaces Max Verstappen at the top of the podium is Fernando Alonso? I think who would not love to see him winning a Grand Prix again? Can they do it? Time will tell. I know it's an old well-worn phrase. Time will tell. Fingers crossed in many respects. Out of everybody that I would like to see win a Grand Prix, from an Aussie perspective, I know everybody wants to see Oscar, or Daniel's not going to do it this year. He's not going to be on top of the podium again. But
Oscar, a remarkable race.
It'd be a remarkable race. But for one guy to win a Grand Prix this season, I would love to see Fernando Alonso back on top. But have Aston Martin got it within themselves? I think they have. We know they've got the resources. We know they've got, the new factories behind them now. They've played down the excuse that changing factory a few weeks back was the cause. They've said, no, that's not the case. Everything was quite smooth and harmonious in moving into their brand new facilities. You kind of still feel there's always going to be that little bit of catch up somewhere along, but they said there's no lag, so they're not using that as an excuse. They've got the personnel, they've got the facilities, they've got the finances, they've got the driver in particular in Fernando. And if that's the case, then, and if they can recognise where they've gone wrong and they're building on that, then they should have a much stronger second half of the season, as I say, from the Italian Grand Prix onwards. What about you though, Michael? What's your key aspect? What's the one thing that you think you're looking forward to for this second half of the season?
Yeah, normally I would say new winners. Like, I love to see a new winner in Formula One. I think that's sort of the lifeblood of any sport, right? And not only seasons like this where we're getting a lot of one particular winner, but in general. And, you mentioned Oscar Piastri as a new driver, obviously, but Lando Norris, likewise, yet to win a Grand Prix, has had very few opportunities, admittedly. We got that with Carlos Sainz last year. Unfortunately, it wasn't in a season where he could really back that up. So if we have to break the Red Bull, if we have to go past that red line that I've drawn and break the Red Bull streak, I'd love for it to be a new winner. I mean, Fernando Alonso, yes, it would be such a great story, wouldn't it? And that would be, in some respects, I guess, a new team winning in a way. Aston Martin is a new team winning, I suppose. And that could qualify, let's say, if we want Fernando to win. But I would love to see, even if we get one of those unusual races in the same way we saw Pierre Gasly deliver a victory for himself, or Esteban Ocon, towards the end of the year, when the championship's wrapped up, when maybe some mechanics and teams and even drivers are starting to think about their off-season holidays, I'd love to see an unexpected new winner in Formula One and start to build a little bit of a narrative for themselves. And fortunately, because we do have potentially, as we've talked about, 5 teams in the front-running group, we have a reasonable selection of drivers to choose from as well, notwithstanding we might get, again, one of those unusual races where Daniel Ricciardo might win. Seems very unlikely. Or anyone towards the back. Could a Haas driver winning? That would be wildly unrealistic. But it can happen in those really odd races. So, and we always, recently, in the last couple of years, we've tended to have one of those races, haven't we? We've almost reliably been able to say that we one race each year and have an unusual driver on pole and maybe even a winner you don't expect. Obviously, we haven't had that yet this year. No. So if the streak's got a break, I want it to be one of those races. I want to see one of those races happen. I'd love to see, a McLaren winning would be remarkable considering the last few seasons they've had. I mean, if Aston Martin can get back to being second, then they would absolutely deserve it, and that would restore that fascinating story we've had for this year as well, wouldn't it? So that for me is something I would love to see. That's more of maybe that's less of what I'm looking forward to and what I would really love to see this season if it's got a break. So, but there are plenty of things I'm sure everyone at home listening would be looking forward to this season. Leave your predictions perhaps, or even your hopefuls in the comments ahead of the Dutch Grand Prix. Could this be the weird race? Well, we don't know. Could be any race. You don't expect them. That's the beauty of it. We will be back next week to wrap up all the goings on at the Dutch Grand Prix. And you can subscribe to Pit Talk wherever you get your favourite podcasts. Between now and then, you can even watch the video on YouTube if you're not already doing that. Just search for Fox Sports Australia. And of course, throughout the Dutch Grand Prix weekend, you can read coverage at foxsports.com.au and speedcafe.com. Until next week, from Ian Parks and me, Michael Laminato, we'll catch you next time.
Thank you, folks.